In April of 1944, a German captain opened his field report and did something officers are trained not to do. He left the result line blank, not because he lacked the facts, because the facts looked impossible. He had sent nearly 300 men up a limestone ridge in central Italy against a position his scouts believed was held by 17 Americans. By nightfall, the ridge was still American. The German column had stopped, and under the casualty figures, in the narrow margin of the report, he wrote one sentence no one at divisional headquarters wanted to explain. The position refused to collapse. Not the men, not the line, the position. As if the hill itself had made a decision. That is how strange the day felt to the soldiers who tried to take it. 17 Americans, one broken ridge, a German assault force large enough to roll over them by every rule in the manual, and a fight that almost vanished from American memory because it happened in the campaign everyone was already trying to forget. Italy, 1944. The war between the famous headlines. While newspaper maps pointed toward France, while staff officers argued over the future invasion across the Channel, men in the Apennines were being killed for stone walls, mule paths, olive terraces, and ridge lines that looked worthless until you had to cross the valley beneath them. The German army understood Italy with a cold kind of genius. A ridge did not need to be high to dominate a road. A farmhouse did not need to be strong to become a bunker. A river did not need to be wide to become a graveyard. Field Marshal Kesselring's defense used the country itself as a weapon. Every fold in the ground slowed the Allies. Every mountain shoulder could hide a machine gun. Every narrow road could be turned into a funnel. By the spring of 1944, Allied units had spent months learning a brutal truth. In Italy, distance was not measured in miles. It was measured in exposed yards, in the men who fell crossing them, and in the hours it took to drag the wounded back down. That was the world surrounding Point 468. On a map, it was nothing, just a contour mark above a road that twisted through the gray-green mountains north of the Leary Valley. But from the crest, a man could watch movement in 3 directions. He could see mule tracks feeding into the valley. He could see the shallow approach where infantry would have to climb without cover. And he could see the kind of ground that decides whether a battalion moves by noon or stops for the rest of the day. The Americans holding it came from a battered rifle company attached to the 168th Infantry, 34th Division. They were not fresh. They were not famous. They were not sitting behind a prepared fortress. They had scraped shallow fighting holes into rock that did not want to be dug. They had stacked loose stone where sandbags should have been. They had rifles, grenades, 2 automatic weapons, 1 field telephone that worked only when the wire was not cut, and ammunition they counted more carefully every hour. Their officer was First Lieutenant Daniel Rourke, 24 years old, from Enid, Oklahoma. Rourke did not look like the kind of man who would become a problem in German paperwork. He had a narrow face, a quiet voice, and the habit of answering panic with procedure. Before dawn, he walked the line with each man, not once, again and again. He pointed out where the slope bent, where shadows would make a German helmet disappear, where the first burst should hit, where no one was to fire early. He told one man to cover the broken wall, another to watch the shallow draw, another to hold his fire until the enemy passed the black stump halfway up the rise. It was not heroic speech. It was geometry. And by sunrise, those 17 men were not 17 separate men anymore. They were one trap laid across a ridge. The German force ordered to take Point 468 belonged to a Panzer Grenadier battalion that had already fought enough in Italy to hate American artillery and respect American stubbornness. Its assault commander, Captain Klaus Brenner, did not expect an easy morning, but he did expect a normal one. The logic was simple. A thin American outpost cut off on a forward ridge could be suppressed by mortars and rushed by infantry. The first wave would force the defenders to keep their heads down. The second wave would reach the crest. If the Americans did not withdraw, they would be overrun. That was not arrogance, that was math. And war, most days, is cruelly obedient to math. At 0520 hours, the German mortars opened. The shells walked along the crest, lifting dust, rock chips, and scraps of winter grass into the air. The Americans folded into their holes. A stone wall collapsed near the left position. One man was cut above the eye by rock. Another had his rifle buried and dug it out with both hands while the barrage was still falling. Then the mortars lifted. For 2 seconds there was only wind. Then German infantry began moving up the slope. They moved well, not like a mob, not like amateurs. They spread out in the gray light, low and disciplined, using every bend in the hillside. A German sergeant named Otto Lenn later told interrogators that he remembered being irritated by the silence. He had expected nervous fire. He had expected the ridge to flash and chatter the moment his men began climbing. But nothing came. The Americans were waiting. Lenn said, the silence made the slope feel longer. That was Rourke's first victory. He had made trained men wonder what they were walking into before a single shot was fired. The first burst came when the lead Germans reached the black stump. Not before, not after, exactly there. Fire snapped from the crest in intersecting lines. A man moving behind one stone wall was hit from an angle he had not seen. A squad trying to push through the shallow draw found itself under fire from the right. A machine gun fired in short, disciplined bursts, then went quiet, then opened again from a slightly different notch in the rocks. To the Germans below, it sounded as if the ridge had far more men than it did. Private Ernst Keller, captured 2 days later, said it this way. It was not heavy fire at first. It was correct fire. Every place we moved, someone was already waiting for us. Correct fire. That phrase matters. Because what stopped Brenner's first assault was not volume. It was in control. The first attack came apart in less than 10 minutes. Brenner did not panic. He was too experienced for that. He called for more mortar fire, shifted the angle, and sent the second assault higher along the slope. That was what a competent officer was supposed to do. Find the edge, test it, break it. The second assault climbed into a different problem. Rourke had expected the adjustment. During the shelling, he had moved 2 men out of a damaged position and tucked them behind a low shelf of stone where they could fire across the new approach. When the Germans came up, they were not met by the same defense. They were met by the next one. This is where German testimony begins to change tone. The first failure could be explained. Bad timing, bad visibility, underestimated defenders. The second failure could not be dismissed as easily. Sergeant Lenn wrote in a post-war letter that after the second withdrawal, the men stopped speaking loudly. That is a small detail, but soldiers know what it means. Noise is confidence. Jokes are confidence. Complaints are confidence. Silence is when a unit begins calculating privately whether the officers understand what is happening. Captain Brenner understood enough to be angry. He asked for heavier mortar support. He brought up a reserve platoon. He ordered the third assault to go straight at the center, where the shelling had torn open 2 of the American positions. Inside the American line, the ridge no longer felt like a position. It felt like a shelf of broken teeth. The field telephone was dead. Ammunition was lower than Rourke admitted out loud. 2 men were wounded. One automatic rifle had jammed, been cleared, jammed again, and was now being treated like a sick animal everyone needed to survive. Private Sam Blevins, a 19-year-old from western Kentucky, later said he remembered looking at his last full clip and thinking it looked too small to be part of a war. That is the kind of thought men have when fear has stopped being dramatic and become practical. Not, will I die? But, how many rounds do I have before the answer arrives? Rourke kept moving, not because moving was safe. It was not. He moved because stillness would have made him invisible, and invisibility, in that moment, would have been fatal. Men do not always need speeches under fire. Sometimes they need to see one person behaving as if the line still exists. Rourke crouched beside Blevins and asked how many rounds he had. Blevins lied and said enough. Rourke looked at him, took 2 clips from his own pouch, and placed them in the dirt. No speech, no drama, just metal in the dust. Blevins said that was the moment he stopped thinking about the Germans and started thinking about the man next to him. That is how small units hold. Not because fear disappears, because fear is forced to share space with obligation. The third assault reached closer than the first 2. German grenades landed near the broken wall. One American position was nearly rolled from the flank. For a few minutes, the fight became too close for clean maps. Men fired downward into shapes. Grenades came back up. Dust hung so thick across the crest that the morning looked brown. Then Corporal Luis Medina from El Paso crawled 10 yards under fire to a dead angle behind the damaged stone wall and fired across the German flank. It was not a charge. It was not the kind of scene painters choose. It was a man crawling because standing would get him killed, dragging his rifle through rock splinters, doing one ugly necessary thing at the exact moment the line needed it. The third assault broke. By late morning, Captain Brenner had a problem that no longer looked tactical. It looked psychological. His men could see the ridge. They could see how small it was. They could see that no company of Americans was hiding behind it, and still they could not take it. The visible evidence and the military's expectation no longer matched. That is one of the most dangerous moments in combat. When men are ordered to do something that should be possible, and the ground keeps proving that it is not. Brenner ordered a 4th assault before noon. This time, he pushed 2 groups around the right side, hoping to stretch the American defense until it snapped. Rourke had only one answer left. He shortened the line. He gave up 15 yards of useless crest and pulled his men tighter around the highest rock shelf. From below, it may have looked like weakness. It was not. It was concentration. The Americans were no longer trying to hold every inch. They were holding the inch that mattered. The 4th assault came through smoke, shouting, and mortar dust. The Germans reached the abandoned holes and thought, for a few seconds, that the defense had cracked. Then the tightened American line opened from the rock shelf above them. The men who had climbed into the empty positions were trapped between the slope and the crest. Brenner later described this moment with the dry bitterness of a professional soldier. The enemy had reduced his frontage and increased his effect. In plain language, Rourke had done the one thing a small force must do when it cannot become larger. He made the battlefield smaller. The 4th assault fell back in pieces. After that, Brenner requested permission to pause. Permission was denied. The battalion's movement was tied to a larger flanking plan, and point 468 was not important enough on paper to explain a delay. That was the curse of the ridge. It looked too small to matter until it stopped everything behind it. A 5th assault was assembled in the afternoon. By then, the sun had burned through the morning gray, and the hillside was bright enough for every man to see the cost of the previous 4 attempts. Bodies and equipment marked the climb. A German machine gun team tried to cover the advance from a lower terrace. American rifle fire found it. A runner went down, carrying messages Brenner needed delivered. The mortar crews, low on prepared targets, began firing less accurately. Everything was becoming harder, slower, worse. Inside the American position, the defenders were near the edge. One man had been hit in the shoulder and refused to leave because there was nowhere meaningful to leave to. Another was down to German ammunition gathered from a captured pouch that did not fit his weapon and therefore did him no good at all. The last grenades were divided by hand. Rourke gave one to Medina, one to Blevins, one to a quiet corporal named Peter Novak, who had not spoken since breakfast. Then Rourke kept the last one. Blevins later said he understood what that meant and tried not to understand it. The fifth assault was the closest. German infantry reached within grenade range along the right lip of the ridge. For nearly a minute, both sides were close enough to hear individual voices, not commands. Voices. A man coughing, a man praying, a man calling for a medic who could not come. Then Novak, the corporal who had been silent all morning, stood halfway out of his hole and threw his last grenade into the dead ground below the crest. The blast did not win the fight, but it interrupted the exact second when the German push needed to become irreversible. Rourke fired, Medina fired, Blevins fired, the whole Titan line fired, and the fifth assault stopped just short of the shelf. After that, Captain Brenner did not order another attack. He had men enough to try. He did not have a unit in the right condition to make the attempt mean anything. There is a difference, and good officers know it. By dusk, the Germans pulled back down the slope. Point 468 remained in American hands. The official numbers were smaller than legend would want, and larger than the men who survived could forget. German reports listed dozens killed or missing, and more than 90 wounded across the attempts. American losses were lighter, but not light to the men on that ridge. Almost every defender had been cut, burned, deafened, stunned, or wounded in some way. The position had not survived untouched. It had survived used up. That night, when the relief patrol finally reached the crest, the men coming up expected to find a line. Instead, they found something closer to wreckage with rifles. They found stone walls blown apart, empty clips in the dirt, blood on limestone, men who had not slept, not eaten properly, and in some cases could not hear the questions being asked. Lieutenant Rourke was sitting with his back against a rock, writing names on a damp scrap of paper so nobody would be miscounted in the dark. A captain from battalion headquarters reportedly asked him how his men had held. Rourke did not give the answer that belongs in movies. He did not talk about glory. He did not talk about country. He looked back down the slope where the Germans had come from 5 times and said, "We already knew where they had to climb." That was true. But it was not the whole truth. The Germans had known the slope too. They had maps. They had experience. They had numbers. What they did not have was Rourke's line, Rourke's timing, Rourke's calm, or the strange invisible arithmetic that happens when 17 men decide that each man's fear is now responsible for the man beside him. Major Friedrich Voss, a German intelligence officer reviewing the failed attack, wrote the clearest enemy explanation of the day. He did not call the Americans superhuman. He did not flatter them. He analyzed them. He wrote that the defense on Point 468 showed unusual cohesion under local command and warned that small American detachments should not be dismissed when they were encored by visible leadership and prepared fields of fire. That phrase matters too. Visible leadership, prepared fields of fire, not myth, not magic, mechanism. The ridge held because men had been placed correctly, because fire had been disciplined, because a young lieutenant had converted ground into a weapon, and because the defenders trusted the weapon they had become. That is what the German report was trying to say without sounding impressed. But the impression is there anyway. It is in the repeated assaults. It is in the casualty columns. It is in the recommendation not to engage similar positions carelessly again. And it is in that strange sentence written in the margin. The position refused to collapse. After the war, Point 468 did not become famous. No marble monument rose above the road. No school children memorized the names. The men who had been there returned to ordinary lives with the particular silence common to veterans of forgotten places. Daniel Rourke went home to Oklahoma and ran a hardware store with his brother. Sam Blevins worked highway maintenance in Kentucky. Luis Medina became a mechanic in El Paso. Peter Novak, who threw the grenade that bought the final seconds on the ridge, rarely mentioned Italy at all. Their families knew pieces: a medal in a drawer, a photograph in uniform, a limp that got worse in winter, a man who sat with his back to restaurant walls without explaining why. That is how many battlefield stories survive in America, not as legend, as habits, as silence, as objects no one asks about until the people who can answer are gone. But the German paperwork survived. The report survived. The interrogation summaries survived. The enemy's confusion survived. And sometimes that is what history gives us. Not the applause men deserved, just the astonishment of the people who failed to move them. A battalion looked at 17 Americans on a ridge and saw a problem that arithmetic could not solve. 5 times the Germans climbed. 5 times the line answered. By every ordinary measure, Point 468 should have fallen before breakfast. Instead, it held until dark, not because the ridge was strong, because the men on it made it strong. And for one day in the mountains of Italy, 17 soldiers became something more difficult to move than stone. They became the ridge.